think part of the human condition and psyche, looking at, we want the obvious fix, we want the quick fix, we want the thing that we know works. But oftentimes the things that make the biggest difference are the like cumulative net effect of all of these small habits and things that we do, these practices, these, subtle little ways that we speak to ourselves. That is what creates a shift in how you feel.
Hi, I'm the self-development coach, Johnny Lawrence, and welcome to the Self-Development Podcast. On today's episode, I'm chatting with breathwork coach and founder of the Breath Space, Jamie Clements. Having discovered breathwork 4 years ago, the practice had a profound impact on him. Jamie found that it significantly improved his physical and mental well-being and helped him move through severe anxiety and panic attacks. He truly believes that breathwork is the most universal, powerful and accessible tool to change our bodies and minds and live healthier, happier lives. Having now trained in different modalities of breathwork, he believes in teaching across the full spectrum, including functional breathing, performance breathing, nervous system regulation, and deep healing modalities of breath. Jamie started the Breath Space as an accessible way for anyone to experience this blossoming area of healing and personal growth, and his goal is to provide you with the tools to work it into your daily life, as well as creating an environment to go deeper and understand new elements of yourself. How are you today, Jamie?
I'm doing really well, thanks, mate. Yeah, it's slightly. Oh, it's actually gotten sunny. I was going to say a rainy Friday, but yeah, it's brightened up a little bit. So yeah, no, it's been a good week, and yeah, I'm happy to be here having a chat with you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. I think we share a few sort of similar ethoses on life. So I think it's going to be a really fun conversation. I'm glad it's sunny for you, though. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to be a bit of a hater and say it's raining outside. So, if I live in Cornwall, like I was told that it's sunny, but it rains all the time.
Yeah.
just rains all of the time. But how's things going, man? The breath space and all that, it's going from strength to strength. How's things going there?
Yeah, it's been an amazing start to the year. I think one of my goals for this year was to get better at reflecting. So I always kind of like these questions. I'm very good at moving forward and not always good at kind of looking at how I got here and reflecting and celebrating those things. So yeah, things are really, really good. I think it's an exciting time for the breathwork space as a whole, and I'm fortunate to be a part of that and a part of that conversation, and on a personal level, yeah, just been a really lovely start to the year. Lots going on. I've sort of had these first 3 months of being in London, fairly settled in one spot, and then starting from April onwards, I've got a lot of moving around, a lot of retreats, a lot of travel, which again, I'm very excited about, but I'm also aware that things are going to get pretty crazy pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's one of the things, isn't it? With self-development, we like to create a feeling of control. But I think what we always have to be aware of, and I'm sure you know this, is that there is no such thing. And it's just that reminder to yourself every now and again, oh yeah, I've fooled myself again to believing that I can control stuff, but I can't.
Yeah, just like looking and being like, oh, why am I really having a tough time at the moment? Oh yeah, it's because I'm trying to control things that are outside of my control. Brilliant. Yeah. Been here 1,000 times before and will be here 1,000 times again, kidding myself into the illusion of control. So yeah, just always trying. I had a moment probably 2-3 weeks ago where I was just I was in a weird headspace. I was, worrying about I was worrying about money. I was worrying about, little nitty gritty things that didn't normally get to me. And I just realized I was just obsessing over control. I was just really trying so hard to control everything, and I was doing myself damage. And I think I had a really lovely reminder from a friend and sort of colleague of mine, just that word surrender, just like surrender with a plan. It's this like beautiful midsection as you talked about as well, of like that you want to let go, you want to surrender, but you need to have a plan and you need to have systems. And so it's just that constant kind of ebb and flow between those two, which is all part of the game. It's all part of the fun.
It's always about trying to create that harmony, isn't it? Just that harmony between helping people, but not helping people so much that you take a lot of yourself away. And it's like, I recognize one of the things I resonate with you about is I can see that, like, let's be honest, I'm not talking negatively about anybody in particular, but there are people that are in the self-help industry and their intention isn't to help people. It's something different, and that's okay. That's fine. But when you see somebody and you resonate with somebody who just loves helping people, gets everything from that, it can be a quite addictive feeling to help somebody, to know that you can, to know that you have this tool, this talent, this way with words, whatever it is that resonates with people and allows them to give themselves the permission to feel better about whatever it is that's bothering them. And you have that in you have that breath work, but not only that, you're an incredible communicator. And I think that those things together, along with many other things, I'm sure, I can see how you could get carried away with that feeling, and you can start giving more and more of yourself away, and then scratching your head wondering why you feel a little bit wrecked. I mean, just recently I've been waking up at like 3 a.m. and I don't know why, but then I spend the remainder of the night thinking about all this stuff, and then I go, oh, that might be why.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
100%. And yeah, thank you for those kind words as well. I appreciate it, mate. I really do. It is a fascinating one, because I think there's again, it's a fine line. You've got to manage yourself within the work that you do. And I think it's probably a lesser talked about element of, working in a position of service where you're supporting people and helping people, which is, it's, you can lose yourself in it. You can over-identify with it. You can give too much. And I think in this pursuit of service to others, you can often come to a place where you feel like it's your duty to, and actually you need to serve yourself as well as kind of being able to support other people. And I've actually been having some challenges, not severe, but for the first time in a while, some challenges with my sleep as well. And I had 8 days in a row, and my spiritual friends got well excited about this, because I had 8 days in a row where I woke up and I checked my clock and it was 3:33.
Oh man.
8 days in a row. And I was like, I put it out on my stories. I was like, all right, spiritual friends, what does this mean? And I had all sorts of answers, but I also am aware of just the moments where, and this is where my own work within my work with others has been really helpful, because I can feel it in my body. I can feel, my nervous system shifting in a certain way when I am slightly overexerting myself, or when I haven't been staying on top of certain practices. And so just being able to actually listen to my body in a lot of ways is helpful in correcting that stuff. But it just, I think within that, there's it's something I always have to come back to, which is my role in what I do isn't, and I think this is a social media thing as well that we see a lot happening, which is, my role isn't to heal somebody. My role is to empower somebody to heal themselves.
Oh,
and I think that's where it's easy for the ego to get carried away, and like where God complexes show up, and where that ego inflation comes from in the spirituality space and the wellness space, where people are like, oh, I'm healing these people, that must mean that I'm Jesus. I'm the best person in the world. And actually it's like, nah, you might be really great at what you do, but ultimately our role is to provide that space for others to help themselves. And I think that's a really important thing that I always just consistently try to remind myself, is that I'm not special in any way, but at the same time we're all special in our own little ways. So I think it's just always coming back to that balance between the two.
It's that contradiction in life, isn't it, that we often see. I totally resonate with that. I really do, because I realized a little while ago I felt the pressure of feeling like I had to help people, because or I had to solve people's problems, is probably a better way of putting it. And then I realized that I'm not that arrogant. I cannot believe that I have got the answer for everybody. That doesn't make sense. But what I do know is that when people come to me, and they have this problem, they are also revealing to you the answer. But the problem isn't that they don't know what the answer is. The problem is that the answer's hard, and it's scary, and it makes you want to turn away and bury your head in the sand. And that's the problem you're having. You need a bit of support, bit of encouragement. maybe a bit of more helpful perspective. Maybe you're looking at something in an unhelpful way, and you need a little bit of help looking at it in a more helpful way, or a way at least that lets you get somewhere, But have you heard Dr. Julia Smith, or Dr. Julie Smith, sorry, her book? She says something really profound, and she said that all of these things that we do, like exercise, going outside, eating healthy, getting good sleep, all of these things that we do are always the first thing to go when we start to go downhill. And she said that is like being half time in a football game and taking off all your defensive players. She said, like, it might not change the end of the game, but it will control how much you lose. And I thought that was such a lovely way to put it, because she's right. Like, you stop sleeping, then you just want to sit and watch Netflix and eat Maltesers. And I get it. In principle, I get it. It makes sense, but it's not going to help. It's not going to help.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's this funny, I think, part of the human condition and psyche, looking at, we want the obvious fix. We want the quick fix. We want the thing that we know works. But oftentimes the things that make the biggest difference are the like cumulative net effect of all of these small habits and things that we do, these practices, these, subtle little ways that we speak to ourselves. That is what creates a shift in how you feel. And that, because they're small and subtle and quite nuanced in a lot of ways, it's easy to let them go because they're not obviously helping. So they're not obviously going to make an impact, or we think they're not obviously going to make a negative impact if we let them go. It's like, oh, I'll just, I'll get delivery for dinner every night this week. And, because I can't bring myself to go to the food shop or to cook or to think of what I want to cook. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, why do I feel rubbish? And you almost can't notice it unless you are kind of in that headspace that Julie's described, of just like, oh yeah, I need to stay on top of these small things in order for the big picture to stay, congruent and positive and sort of in forward motion. So yeah, a good reminder for myself as well.
Yeah, it is hard, and that's it. That's why I'm, it's very easy for people to put myself, and anyone else in a self-help, the personal development sphere, as gurus. I loathe that a little bit. I'm not going to lie, because it's a lot of pressure, but I have got helpful perspective. Some of it comes from, a lot of it comes from some really unpleasant experiences. A lot of it comes from some education by spending time with people like yourselves, or people that are knowledgeable about something in a really helpful way. But a lot of the time that just, I've got a mentor, and he says, when education meets experience, it creates wisdom. And I love that, because it's true. It's like, it's that missing that gap. We can all read a book and go, oh, if I apply that, it'll work. But we also know them subtle nuances of sometimes you don't want to. And it's quite a powerful feeling, it's a really powerful feeling. But I think we've been going for about 10 minutes and we haven't even got into the meat of it yet. But I mean, for those that might not have come across you yet, could you tell people a bit about yourself and your journey so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had what I would describe as a very traditional sort of upbringing and childhood. So I was pretty academic growing up. I was also big into my sport. I played football to a high level as a kid, and then rugby kind of in my teens and early 20s to a high level as well. Went to university, got a degree in economics, had grand ambitions of being an investment banker, realized very quickly that wasn't what I actually wanted. And sort of through that period of my late teens and early 20s, I started having some challenges around my mental health, with depression, anxiety, panic attacks, that just sort of built up into my early 20s. And then I stepped out of the work that I was doing at that time. I didn't step out straight away. I sought help. I got into therapy. I was getting into yoga, into meditation, into lots of different things, and then discovered breathwork. And breathwork really was, as you mentioned in the intro, sort of the thing that made the difference to me. It was the real shift. Lots of those other practices, I still have a pretty steady yoga practice. I still meditate really regularly. All of those are still there, but there was something about breathwork and that particular work that just shifted a huge amount for me, and it really opened me up to a very different experience of life I'd been lacking for quite a long time, and then really immersed myself in that world, traveled a little bit with it to experience it in different forms, in different ways, in different cultures, and then started training, started learning, started educating, as you said, sort of combining the experience that I had with the education side of it to try and get to some place where I felt comfortable, confident, competent in sharing that with other people, which is still an ongoing process, as it is for everyone. And yeah, then launched the breath space, my practice alongside that, and have been working with some amazing people, working with clients, working with businesses, with athletes, with groups, retreats, anything, sort of anybody and everybody, to introduce breathwork to them and the benefits of this full spectrum of what breathwork has to offer. I think alongside all of that, I often forget that I've also done other things. So I used to have a very keen interest, and still do, in the realm of sort of men's mental health and masculinity, and looking at gender and in relation to mental health. And I used to have a podcast myself called Man Down, for a couple of years, that was on that topic, and actually working on a new podcast with a friend of mine at the moment that is on that thread again of masculinity and mental health and wellness. So that's sort of how I got here. But the breath work and the breath space as a business is my, I suppose, my bread and butter and my day to day and my passion. So yeah, there's a bit of an intro to where I've been and how I got here.
So something really intrigued me there, because I see it a lot in clients, and that is the symptom of, let's just call it depression for a moment, just to make it easier for us to contain it. But that symptom of depression that comes when you become unaligned with your values. So you have core values, you have things that you desire, and for whatever reason, you're not living up to them. And I don't know if I might be wrong, but I heard it there when you were talking, and you said, I was going towards investment banking. And I just, I believe you could do anything you want, but you won't strike me as someone that would want to do that. So it's interesting to me.
Yeah. It's a fascinating one. I think the first ever book I read of any kind of personal development, self-help, anything around this topic was Lost Connections by Johann Hari.
Oh, yeah.
And that, I think, that opened my eyes to what you just described, which was this misalignment, or the old Brené Brown thing that I love, the difference between fitting in and belonging.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I became so adept, and I know exactly why this process started for me. But I became so adept at fitting in, at being accepted, at ultimately like morphing who I was to fit what I thought would get me love. I think is probably a pretty apt way to describe life for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And what I realized, I've realized over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, was I was just, sacrificing authenticity for acceptance. And that is a painful thing to realize, but an empowering thing to realize as well, because then you can start to actually take back some autonomy and some authenticity. And that for me, I think, as far as what I would term when I experienced depression, was a symptom of that. It was just, past experiences feeding into it, but also just living a life that somewhere inside of myself, not necessarily consciously initially and cognitively, but somewhere deep inside myself, I knew that wasn't me.
Yeah.
And so it was like a realization of that, but then eventually kind of a reclamation of that, and like a getting back to. And I think that's a lot of what the healing journey is realigning and realizing who you are, and then coming slowly and gradually back to that, and making some mistakes along the way.
Yeah. And it's a really scary place to be, because that if you want to pursue fulfillment, that you have to do things sometimes dramatically differently. And that is terrifying, because this is what, like we said earlier, we want to believe that we've got control and we know what's going to happen. And that acceptance and that realization that we don't is terrifying a little
For
bit.
sure.
It's probably actually the very definition of anxiety.
Yeah. And I think often this is a realization I had quite recently with a piece of my healing journey that I've kind of been going through of late, which was the reason why we repeat patterns and the reason why it's a bit of like an upward spiral where some of the same stuff shows up even once you're aware of it, which is awareness alone isn't enough. And often it's only at the point where the pain of staying the same is bigger than the fear of change that you actually decide to change. It's like this weird equation where it's like, okay, I cannot, like, I physically, this hurts too much to stay the same, so things have to change. And that is scary and it's confronting, but it always serves the purpose that it needs to when it does happen.
I've got a friend called Patrick who works a lot with people in the addiction space, and he says that if somebody comes to him, his first question is, have you had enough pain yet? You know, because it kind of, in order to make a substantial change like that, unfortunately, you like exactly as you worded it, you have to desire that more than this. You know, it's simple as that. You're having this really painful experience, but actually, you're in pain now, and this is going to be painful. Choose it. You know,
yeah, choose your pain, pick your poison.
Yeah. And you know, another thing I think that's prevalent is that as we grow up, we can adopt other people's preferences as our values. And people can have these preferences and tell you their preferences, and you see how they're living their life. There might be aspects of that you admire, and you start to adopt their preferences as your value system. And then slowly but surely that stops you from recognizing your own value system. And then you fall out of alignment. And before you know it, you've committed to this big thing. Maybe it's uni, maybe it's a job, maybe it's whatever. And you're like, 6 years down the line, like scratching your head going, why am I so unhappy? I've got everything I want. And then you start to get in the guilt and shame cycle, which is a perpetuating thing. So yeah, it's really interesting. I'm really grateful for you sharing all that. And very curious about the whole masculinity thing. That's interesting. I saw that you had the podcast, and when I looked it up, it looked like it had stopped. Yeah. So I mean, what is that about for you? What do you mean when you say that?
So that for me, looking back on it now, I've not recorded that particular podcast for about a year and a half, probably two years. And that for me, when I do listen back and when I look back on it, like I see a different person. Like I see a much earlier version of the person I am now. And it was a real, without realizing at the time, it was very personal for me in terms of my own process and my own journey around in relation to my masculinity and my experience as a man. I think it came from a place of pain and a bit of a realization that some of my challenges with my mental health weren't helped by, you know, traditional kind of patriarchal values of masculinity and how I, you know, lived and grew up as a man. I also, it was quite acutely sort of brought forward in a way. I lost a friend from school to suicide in 2019. And there were a lot of lessons and kind of things I took away from that really difficult experience that also related to sort of life as a man and men's mental health, and really just like this epidemic of male suicide. And so there was a real, I guess, drive and determination underlying it. But then actually the process itself of those episodes was therapeutic in a lot of ways. It was me kind of trying to understand this relationship between masculinity and vulnerability and different experiences of being a man, looking at other elements like race and sexuality within that, and speaking to men who look like me, men who don't look like me, men who, you know, speak like me, think like me, and those who don't as well. And it was such an amazing experience. Like, you know, one of my best friends now was someone that came on my podcast. And so that for me, like, serves its purpose in a lot of ways, because it taught me so much about myself as well. And, you know, I'm fortunate that it was able to support a lot of people along the way. And I had some guests that when I first started the podcast, I probably would have laughed if someone had suggested that I might get Tom Odell on my podcast. So like, okay, yeah, maybe if I dream really big. And then it all happened. So yeah, ended up doing about 60 episodes over 2 years. And then it felt like it had run its course. But it's still something it's still a cause that I'm very much involved in. It's like a personal fascination as well, sort of masculinity, energetics, polarity, all of this stuff that's getting talked about a lot at the moment on social media as well. So yeah, it's more of, I suppose, like a personal involvement now rather than anything overtly professional. Yeah.
I think all good podcasts are. I think, unless you're at a certain status in life, I don't think you go into podcasting to make money. It's not about, that's not the pursuit. For me, it's about the opportunity to learn from incredible people. And I do, and I think it is a crime, that you don't have the podcast at the moment. And I'm very pleased to hear that you're going to look to go back into it. But I think one of the things for me with masculinity is the option of curiosity, is allowing ourselves as men to be curious. Asking someone about their sexuality doesn't infer anything. It's just a question. It's just showing an interest. It's being curious. It's trying to understand. It's trying to relate. And you can relate. And then you have the fear, oh, if I relate to this person who's gay, does that mean I'm gay? No, it doesn't mean any of that. It might do, and that's okay. Either is okay. But it's about having that understanding that, we need to be more curious about things, and we need to have an openness and a willingness to understand other people's ways of thinking. I think that's there's a beauty to that, and it's a freedom to that, a real freedom to that. Like, it's like racism, as you can imagine. I've encountered racism many times in my life, and people ask me about it, and I say, to me, racism's about intention. What was your intention? Because a lot of people get jumped on for saying certain things in certain ways. I shared this story with someone the other day. My son plays rugby every Sunday, and I was standing on the side of the rugby pitch, and there was an older chap behind me, white man, and I live in Cornwall, so joking. There's a lot of white people.
There's a few.
There's not a lot of black people in Cornwall. And I was standing there, and this chap was telling a story, and he referred to someone as being coloured. And I heard it, but doesn't affect me. I don't respond to things like that, really. It doesn't matter to me. And everyone sort of gasped and looked at me, and I was just like, right, look, cheering my son on, like, this is all good. But then later on in the clubhouse, this lady comes over to me, and she was very well-meaning and very lovely, and she just came over and she apologized to me, and I said, what for? And genuinely at that moment, I didn't know what she was talking about. And she said, oh, I heard the chap on the side there say the word coloured. And I went, oh, okay. I said, listen, how old do you think he is? And she said, I don't know, maybe in his 60s. I said, yeah. I said, to him, that is him trying to be politically correct. And just because the names change and things like that, it's sort of unreasonable to expect somebody of that age to catch up overnight, So I think it's about intention. And I think that we have to be a bit more open-minded these days and less confrontational about all the things that are changing, in a way.
100%. I love this conversation. I think it's actually one of the big drivers behind our new podcast is sort of compassionate nuance, and actually inviting people on that we might not actually agree with, but trying to understand why, and trying to understand their perspective. And don't get me wrong, there's some people out there that, I don't want to understand your perspective because what you're saying is just kind of abhorrent, but it would also be interesting to understand what's your life experience and what's led you to the point where you're now saying this awful thing. And I've had some really, probably in the last 6 months or so, some really amazing, interesting conversations with my parents, who are both in their 60s. And I do hold like a real sense of, I guess, compassion and empathy for the fact that things are changing so quickly.
They are.
And as you said, that was that man's attempt, an effort to do better.
Yes.
Based on what he's heard. And, he's not going to be on social media necessarily. So he's not keeping up with what's okay in, inverted commas. And so to jump on someone like that for actually trying, even if they don't get it right, is really challenging and must be so difficult, especially, everything in our lives is developing and changing at such a pace. To expect everyone to keep up with it and get it right 100% of the time is just so unrealistic. And we're holding people to a standard that we can't even hold ourselves to a lot of the time.
Yeah. And I mean, the animosity that gets caused unnecessarily with people just being curious and asking questions, but it's being taken as offensive. And I'm not sure if it's helpful, My mate's got this saying, he says, if you're not being helpful, you're being a dick. And I swear it's quite helpful. But yeah, no, it's a really great conversation. And I'd love to continue that conversation at some point. But we should probably talk about breath work.
Yeah, we can.
Obviously, we all breathe every day, and there are going to be people that might. I can imagine you've seen it many times. People roll their eyes, "Oh, breath work." Well, I've been breathing for so many times. It's like, yeah. But what is it? What is breath work? For those people that want to understand it, what is breath work?
Yeah, I've had to deal with, and not in a negative sense particularly, but like that is the typical kind of less open-minded response is like, don't need someone to tell me how to breathe. I've been doing it my whole life.
Yeah, can imagine. Suppressed anger.
yeah, exactly. So this I'm always conscious to say is sort of my approach to this work rather than anything overtly gospel. So I believe breathwork is an umbrella term that covers any way that we can use our breath to shift our state physically, mentally, or emotionally. So that's sort of the elevator pitch, and then within that there lives this full spectrum that we've sort of mentioned so far, and within that I've defined 3 pillars. Sort of this is, I guess, my methodology and how I approach breath work, which is functional breathing. So how are you breathing day to day, moment to moment? How do you breathe when you're not thinking about it? We breathe 20,000+ times every single day. What is your breath doing, and how might that be supporting you or not supporting you? And what can you actually do to address potentially underlying unconscious dysfunctions within your natural state of breath? We then have the middle realm, which is more around nervous system regulation. So how can I use my breath as a tool? How can I consciously change my breathing to shift my state? So to either, shift up, you can use it to upregulate the nervous system, or to shift down and calm and relax the nervous system. So it acts as a bit of a remote control into our nervous system to create change if we want to. And then we have sort of the deeper end of the spectrum, conscious connected breathwork, healing modalities of breathwork that are opportunities really to experience very profound healing states through the breath. So working with altered states of consciousness, working with emotional processing, the subconscious mind, really kind of quite an expansive, interesting experience. And the reason that I like to lay it out like that is because one end of the spectrum is very different to the other. So, how you're breathing now and a conversation around that is quite far removed from a transcendent psychedelic experience with breathwork in another form. And so that I view sort of as something that underpins a lot of my work, is saying, you've heard the word breathwork, but do you actually know what that means? If you're walking into a breathwork session, that could be anything along that spectrum. So we need to make sure that people are well informed and well educated on what they might be getting themselves in for. So yeah, that's my sort of approach and my methodology around what breathwork is.
What really surprised me when I did any breathwork was how hard it was. It's actually quite difficult. Like once you start to get to it, if you start breathing to numbers, say you're coming in for 7 and out for 11 or something like that, that's quite difficult. That first one, it's like you're very surprised. You're like, wow, I don't know if I can do this. This is hard, But that in itself is very telling, I think. I was really surprised at how difficult I found it. I did yoga a few years ago for various reasons, and I absolutely loved it. And then one thing led to another, and I stopped doing it, and I never got back to it. And I've just recently gone back to it, and I was thinking about why did I stop? I don't understand. I
Yeah.
absolutely love it. It's like something I really look forward to. I only do it once at the moment, a week, but I'd love to try and do it again another time. But it's
Mm.
a yoga, breathing, all of that sort of thing. I find really really helpful. I'm not sure I can articulate why yet. There's a peace that comes with it, and a
Mhm.
clarity that comes with it. But I'm still not there yet as to what it gives me. I'm trying to work that out.
Mm.
But how has breathwork influenced your self-awareness and improved your relationship with yourself?
Oof. Um, so it's so many ways. I think initially I was having this conversation with somebody yesterday when they actually asked me, how's it helped you? What's it given you? And I
Mm.
was thinking back to when I first got into it and the place that I was in at that point in time as this relatively closed-minded, pretty skeptical, early 20s rugby player. And as someone who experienced anxiety for a very long time, um, to varying degrees and severities, I was very used to feeling like a bit of a passenger to my thoughts and a bit of a passenger to my mind and triggers and everything. And it would be, when I was having panic attacks, there'd be a trigger, and very, very quickly I'd be having a panic attack with no real space in between those two things happening. And I was like, oh, here we go again. And actually, to discover a tool that could help me create space in that kind of situation and actually give me a level of autonomy to respond to things that were going on in my life, to say, okay, I feel that the impact of that trigger. What can I do in this moment with my breathing that might support me in like alleviating some of the intensity of what's showing up? And so
Yeah.
that was really, really powerful from an anxiety perspective, and it continues to help me no end. And then I had a number of experiences and continue to have experiences with this deeper end of the breathwork spectrum, these sort of more standalone, profound experiences that, for anyone who has tried will know, you're just able to connect to different parts of yourself. And it's a little bit like what you're saying now about the yoga. It's like, I'm not sure exactly why, but I know that there's something in this. And that was what kept me going with breathwork in the initial instance. I was like, I can't deny that there's something good happening here.
Yeah.
And we can, there are different theories and hypotheses around what is going on. But for me, I was able to connect to my body in a way that I hadn't for a long time, connect to my intuition, get insights from those altered state experiences around things that had happened in my past, around experiences of, these adverse experiences from childhood. And also, it really allowed me to connect to a more broad emotional spectrum, I think,
Yes.
which is really important. I think, especially around that kind of, again, that concept of depression, if we want to call it that, which for me, a lived experience of depression for me personally was very numb. It wasn't necessarily deep, deep lows. There were some, but actually it was just a bit of a gray sort of non-feeling.
Yeah.
Nothing brought me particular joy.
Which is
And
horrible.
it's
That's
a
a
it's a
horrible
it's
way to
it's
feel.
it's a really nasty kind
Yeah.
of, yeah, sort of insidious
Yeah.
experience.
It
And
really is.
that for me, like I experienced in one session, I always remember this session, just this experience of joy and like euphoria. And it was a reminder to a much younger part of myself that I could experience that. And I think I just hadn't experienced it for so long that I forgot that that kind of joy existed. And so I was like, this is a real lived, felt experience that I can experience happiness like that. And so it was just a reconnection to it. And so, yeah, it's given me greater self-awareness. It's given me a real understanding of my nervous system and how I respond and how I can manage my response in certain situations. Um, Someone described it the other day as a bit of a Swiss Army knife, and I do view it like that. Like there are a lot of things that we can do with something that is ultimately very simple,
Mm.
to support ourselves in a lot of different parts of our lives. I think I'm a strong believer that there is no silver bullet, there is no magic pill, but there are things that can sort of take us closer towards that full support for ourselves across physical, mental, and emotional. And breathwork definitely falls into that camp.
Yeah. I mean, you gave me goosebumps there. You just You really articulated that well. And I think what you did there as well is you hit upon something that I feel personally is the crux of the challenges that men are facing. And that is that there's either an unwillingness or an inability to experience and understand the emotions that we're having. And a lot of the time, what we do is we fall back on anger because we're frustrated and we're overwhelmed, and we don't want to admit that we're embarrassed, or we don't want to admit resentment, or we don't want to admit disappointment. Whatever it is, we don't want to admit it. We not to anybody else, but to ourselves. We don't want it to be true. And that plight to not want it to be true, to not let it be true, ends up being anger and frustration and all of these things. And I think a lot of the time when, I talk a lot about anger because it's something that I've had to work through due to childhood experiences. And a lot of the time, if we suppress that anger, which is tempting, we end up letting it go inwards, and we experience what most people will call depression. That will just attack you from the inside out. Or it goes outwards and it looks a bit like rage. Somebody nicks your parking space and you're ready to commit murder, which is not a normal reaction. And that so I think that what you're saying right there, that realizing, because there are, I don't know how many emotions there are, but there are a lot. So when you ask somebody, what's the emotion you're feeling, that's quite a stressful question. It
is.
It's a real stressful question. So to identify it, it's a feeling, and it's hard. Sometimes there's not the language. And I think sometimes what needs to happen for men is they need to be offered a way to communicate their emotions. And then when they communicate it, that feeling and that communication will balance out, or, feel right, So I think it sounds to me like that's what it did for you. It gave you that emotional language.
Massively. And I think one of the really interesting things, I shared a post last year about the power of breathwork for men specifically. I don't often speak to a specific group, but I think it was International Men's Day or Men's Mental Health Awareness Day or something like that. So I was allowed. And one of the things that I think is incredibly powerful about breathwork for men and people who struggle with their emotional expression and struggle to connect to their emotions is that it can also be a non-verbal way to process. So you actually don't have to have the language. Having the language is powerful, but actually to have a felt experience of an emotion is also a really positive first step. And I've been not weirdly, that puts some level of kind of negative on it, but I've been interestingly and quite surprisingly moved by music a lot recently. Like I've always been, music's one of my biggest passions, so I'm always really connected to it. But like I've had a couple of songs sent my way by friends that have almost moved me to tears. And I really view that. I was writing about it the other day, where I was like, one of the lesser talked about and acknowledged markers of our well-being is, do you actually have the capacity to be moved? Like, can you allow something, an experience of awe, an experience of, nature, of wonder, of like, I sometimes get it when I'm hanging out with my niece, where I'm just like overcome by just like joy. I'm just like, you're feeding off their energy. And I think that is something that a lot of these practices can give to us, is actually once you start to feel those feelings, it becomes so much easier every time to connect to them. And actually you start to find that things do move you in a way that maybe they didn't before. And I think that's all, when I allow myself to be like, oh yeah, like that really moved me, I'm like, that's a tick. That's a good sign, because I'm open to that, rather than being so like constrained and confined and numbed to those emotional experiences.
Yeah, it's so interesting you talk about music. Last year I had a really unfortunate thing happen, and I felt sad, and I knew I could feel the emotion. But when I was a kid, I witnessed a lot of domestic violence and was subjected to some abuse as a child, physical abuse. And part of what happened was when my dad used to hit me, if I cried, he'd tell me to stop crying. So I taught myself to stop crying. So I developed nothing to do with masculinity. I just developed a really difficult relationship with tears and crying. And last year I felt at some point that I needed to cry. And I've never listened to Johnny Cash at all, but there's a song that he has called Hurt. And if I play that song around about the third time I play it, I'm in tears. I can't I don't have an explanation for it, but if I know I need to cry, and it's all very sad, I sneak off to the garage and it's got this grown man sat in the garage crying on his own, and it all sounds very sad, but I needed to get that emotion out, and it was interesting to me how music was what I went to. So I totally get that.
Yeah, that song does it for me as well.
Does it really?
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Oh man, it's
Blimey.
I think it's one of those tracks. I think that it's just like whether you're listening to just like how he's singing it, or actually the words themselves, or the combination of all of it. But yeah, it's a beautiful, like, once you can get past that initial like, oh my god, like I'm crying. It's like it's a really beautiful thing to lean into. Because it helps you, like, but it also helps the people around you, because you're not then projecting it out as anger or resentment or bitterness towards family, towards partner, towards kids. Like, it's just I think it should so be celebrated in terms of like allowing ourselves to go to those places.
What I found interesting though was that I was determined, and it wasn't conscious. I don't know what it was, but I wouldn't let my kids see it. Like I was hiding it away from them. And it's maybe it's just a little bit of a remnants of previous thinking, but I'm still working on it, that my kids will see me cry one day or whatever. It's a strange thing. I can't really articulate it very well, but it's an unusual thing. It's
interesting, because I remember, as a kid, I remember seeing my mum cry, and it's a strange experience as a kid, because you view your parents as kind of superheroes, especially when you're really young, and until you learn better. It's a strange experience, but I do think it's an important one, especially as a dad, I think. But these are all processes, right? And like, you'll find your way to engage with that, because their natural reaction probably would be like, oh my god, are you okay? Rather than like, but then it's like the language and how you then go on from that, and actually it's like, like, I'm good, dad just needed to cry because I'm sad, or because I'm this, and that gives me goosebumps, and I'm not even a dad. So
well, I want that. I really do. But there's a block there somewhere that I'm working on. Like, I want that. I want to be able to show them that it's okay, but I can't quite get there yet. It's not a willingness thing. I want to, but it's like, I don't know. It's like having stage fright when you need to go for a wee, I suppose.
100%, man. 100%.
It's a bit like cry, and then it gets a bit silly, because you're like, why am I not crying? Why am I willing myself to cry? What's happening here? It starts to become almost funny. So it's like, but no, it's interesting, really interesting. It's funny to me now. I got you. There's something about you that I really wanted to talk to you. And I thought it was going to be about breath work, but we spent very little time on breath work. It's interesting. I find that interesting.
I love it. I've had a lot of conversations about breath work, and I love it, obviously. And we've had a nice kind of sprinkling of breath work, but I think it's nice. It's
I
nice
like this other
like
stuff.
This other stuff's good too. It's good too.
But I mean, I will sort of come back to it. And what I love is that every time we talk about breathwork, we segue into other things, which I think is your overarching point. I think that is the point that I'm starting to extract from this. And I loved that phrasing you used, that passenger to my thoughts. So that's beautiful. It might even be the title of this, I think, because I did love that. But what should people know about functional breathing, and how can this awareness impact other areas of your life?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and an important question as a starting point for people, because I think that it's the easiest place to begin engaging with your breath and with breath work. And functional breathing, as I mentioned, is sort of this act and this process of looking at how you breathe. So it's going from breathing your whole life, as the critics will say, without thinking about it, not having to think about it, to then coming to a point where you listen to this conversation, or you follow me on Instagram, or you hear about breath work, and all of a sudden you start paying a little bit more attention to it. And so it's then, okay, now that I'm paying attention to it, what should I be paying attention to and looking for? And you can break down the sort of fundamentals of functional breathing fairly simply, I hope, which is an ideal optimal breath should be through the nose. It should be down into the diaphragm and the belly, and it should be slow, and it should be relatively quiet and gentle. So you're looking for a like gentle, slow, deep nasal breath. That is kind of as simple as we can make it. If you're sat on the sofa, if you're in the car, if you're not really, if there's no external kind of forces acting on you from a physical perspective or a mental perspective, that's how we want to be breathing, is through the nose and down into the belly and nice and slowly and gently. There are sort of, I suppose, signs and symptoms of, if we call that the functional breath, what are the signs of a dysfunctional breath? And sort of, I suppose it's in a lot of ways the inverse of that. So we're looking at very short, shallow, fast breathing into the chest, breathing through the mouth. People who experience high levels of breathlessness, so, you know, getting out of breath very easily, always feeling like you need to take a bigger breath, juddery breathing, lots of sighing, and from a sleep perspective, things like sleep apnea, things like waking up with a dry mouth and brain fog. There's a few different kind of indicators. And so within all of that, the real process that we go through is, you know, getting me in your ear, telling you about this stuff. So you're now thinking about it, but then actively practicing, okay, when I remember to, I'm going to breathe light, slow, and deep through the nose. And it's just like, you just build up that practice, sometimes very consciously, where you'll sit and do a dedicated practice, but other times a little bit more subtly, where it's just like, oh, I've got 5 minutes here on the tube, I'm going to change my breathing.
Yeah,
and that's where I think the really good stuff comes in, when you almost just make your breath sort of your reference point. And you're like, and this is again a powerful thing that I found through my own experiences with breathwork, which was, I now do it almost without thinking, but it was definitely a conscious thing to begin with, where I was going, I feel off, I feel stressed, I feel anxious, I feel jittery, I feel tired. What is my breath doing?
Yeah.
Looking at that to connect to the body, connect to the feelings, but then also, once I've got that connection, what can I now do actively with my breath to create a positive shift? And so it's almost becomes a way to understand where you're at, but also to shift where you're at if you want to. So that's typically the journey that I try and take my clients on, especially, is like, okay, we're going to start basic and we're going to gradually build up to it. Like I have started taking much more of like a personal trainer type approach to the work that I do with people privately now, because it's very much meeting people where they're at, rather than just being like, everyone should do this kind of breath work. It's like, no, let's understand this person, their nervous system, their respiratory system, their life experiences, and how can we create something that's going to support them in the best possible way.
Yeah, that you're so right, because them emotions that you talk about, that, you know, especially something like anxiety, can severely impact the way you breathe. And it's interesting, we talked about that feeling of control. I think actually what you've made me realize in the way you explain that was that breath work is one of the first of all, breathing's fundamental, but it's one of the very few fundamentals that you can actually control. Like, you can't control the way your blood flows, for example. Well, you could, but it wouldn't be a good idea. You know, so it's very interesting. I never thought of it quite that way, but that's really helpful.
You've sort of accidentally hit on probably the underlying principle of why breath work is what it is, which is, so the breath is, I'm basically going to put what you just said into slightly nerdier terms, which is
thanks.
So the breath is part of something called the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system governs heart rate, governs pupil dilation, metabolism, digestion, breathing. But the breath is the only part of that system that we can consciously control. So the breath within that can be unconscious and conscious. So we can breathe automatically, as we do a lot of the time, but we can also breathe more consciously and intentionally. And so with that, we have a tool through the breath, a lever, to influence the other parts of that system. So you can slow the heart rate by slowing your breathing, and you can shift, you know, the functioning of your immune system through your breathing. Like, there's so much that the breath is our entry point into these other functions. And I think that's why we're seeing kind of the rise in popularity and acknowledgement of it, because people are going, okay, this actually makes total sense. And more importantly, I can feel the change.
That is the best explanation I've ever heard of breathwork. That was no, that was brilliant. That really was brilliant. That's really ticked the box for me. That is incredible explanation. Thank you for that.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
No, that's brilliant. I love that. Definitely using that as a reel.
yeah,
that's amazing. Again, it's like shift spaces a little bit here. We we've been going now for a while, so I'm conscious of your time, but something I'm really interested in is, can practicing breathwork support working through trauma? Big question for the end, right?
Yeah, big question. Yeah. I find the T word is something I think that has been a very positive and potentially challenging part of social media psychology and wellness space. Because there's a much better understanding of what it is, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding as to what it is. So from personal experience and from professional experience of working with, hundreds and hundreds of people, the answer to that kind of question, can breathwork help with, processing of trauma? My answer would be yes. Not from an empirical evidence standpoint, which some people feel like they need for questions like this, but from more of an anecdotal, experiential standpoint. So when we dip into that deeper end of the breathwork spectrum, we're able to connect more deeply with both the subconscious mind, but also the emotional baggage that we hold in the body and sort of the physiological imprint of things like trauma. So yes, essentially is the answer. We're able to, often people will have experiences where they do connect to, past events, adverse childhood experiences, and they'll very physically feel that emotion or the sensations, or they'll be in that space. And the breath work can actually help people to connect to that, but also to almost complete those unfinished stress cycles, those sort of emotions that they haven't quite fully allowed themselves to express in that moment. Yeah. That's where breathwork comes in as a tool to help and support us through that. And that's where the facilitation of that to create sort of safety within that challenging experience in some cases is really important. So yeah, I believe from my personal and professional experience that it can support in the processing of trauma.
I mean, this is sort of like a work in progress, this thought that I'm having right now, but I can't help myself.
Sure.
But like, I often feel like trauma, one of the symptoms, or not symptoms, it's not the right word, but one of the things that happens with trauma is we have a set of reactions. Some people call it a trauma response. And the way I look at this reaction is, I love analogies. So imagine like a field, and there's a well-trodden track, and you take this track because everyone else takes this track. This must be the way through the field. And then one day you realize that track takes you somewhere you don't want to go anymore. So you have to create a new track, and that's hard because there's brambles and you've got to beat things down, and you're not sure what direction you're going in, and it's all a bit scary. And what if you waste your time, and all these questions that come around. And there's an element of confidence that's needed, and elements of reassurance. And I feel like with breath work, that feeling of gaining control of a part of yourself offers some sort of reassurance, some sort of confidence that allows you to not quite sure how to articulate it, whether it's face the trauma or work with the trauma or acknowledge it, but it gives you something, that feeling of, I'm taking control. I am literally taking control of a part of my body. And, that breath work, like you said, you can change your mood. So if you need to be a bit brave, in the face of fear, you can use breath work. If you need to relax and calm down so you can take in information and get clarity, you can use breath work. And I feel like that might be, and again, I might have to edit it. I'm like, is this a real thought? Or is this a rant? What is this? But I feel like,
I like that thread, because I think quite often the sort of triggered response or the trauma response will show up as almost, it's a very present manifestation of the past pain.
Yeah.
And I think that will show up in your nervous system, right? So that
Absolutely.
will send you into a space where you don't feel safe, even if you might be safe. And one of my favorite little sound bites is that we experience life through the lens of our nervous system. And so if there is a past event, a trauma, if we want to call it that, that is creating a feeling of unsafety and danger in the present moment through your nervous system, you do have a tool through breathwork to create a feeling of safety potentially. And so I think that is, one of the, I guess, very healing properties of learning how you can interact with your own nervous system. I think that's really empowering. It's very powerful. And it gives us that kind of ability to respond, which is lovely. It's all we started at the top talking about control, and how much control can one ever really have, but to have a feeling of some level of control or more control than you had before, that's really empowering. And that to me is almost quite a nice definition of the healing process, is actually learning safety and having a measure of control over things that previously caused you pain.
Yeah. And I think it's even in the word, isn't it? Reaction. It's like a repeat action. It's something you've learned. You had a previous experience that was similar, maybe triggers the same emotion of fear or embarrassment or whatever it is, and your reaction is similar to the one you had originally or before. And now what you have is, like you said, exactly that. And we come full circle. You create space with that breath. That title, I don't know if you know how metaphorical that title is, that breath space. I'm pretty confident it's deliberate. That you're creating that space where you're giving yourself that opportunity to make a choice. And that's pretty, what an incredible answer. I love that.
Thank you,
mate. It's just been wonderful, but I must let you go because it's been ages. It's been absolutely ages. But I always ask everybody at the end, is there anything you'd like to pass on to people that will help them with their self-development?
I think if we're on the same thread, and if I'm staying on brand, just starting hopefully from this conversation to deepen the connection with your own breath and your own body. I think it's so underrated. As you said, just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy, but it is something that can really support us. And I think just always remembering, I think in the moments of the highest suffering, where you're really in a dark place with a particular part of your journey or a particular thing that you're going through, that tends to be the point at which change starts to happen. And I can speak firsthand to that. The darkest moments were the catalyst for the biggest growth. And so finding things, and this is where I go off brand. And if I had a manager, which I don't, they would hate me. But that doesn't have to be breathwork. I'm a big, breathwork can be amazing for a lot of people. And I really believe it's one of the most accessible things that we have access to, but it's not for everyone. And I'm okay with that. And we should all be okay with that. And so it's about finding the things that work for you personally, and trying different things and seeing what sticks. Because what works for one person won't work for someone else. There's no one size fits all approach to healing. And so just finding the things that work for you and just keep on going. There's a quote that I heard the other day while I was out on a run, listening to a podcast that said, "We don't grow in spite of the storm, we grow because of the storm."
Wow, I love that.
That for me is something that keeps me going more often than not.
Jordan Peterson talks about how growth happens when it's triggered by these life events. Those life events trigger that necessity for that new growth. It's like, the way I think of it, love analogies, is like the tree that has the stick next to it when it's growing, and it's like that one that doesn't learns to deal with the weather and the change without the stick. It digs deeper roots. It becomes stronger because it's adapting to its environment. Whereas the one that has the stick relies on the stick until the stick breaks, and then what? You know. So yeah, it's a nice analogy. But just before we go off one again, what's next for you, and where can people find you?
Yeah, it's more of the same, I suppose. I've got a number of retreats out this year that are starting next month. Couple down in Cornwall, down in your neck of the woods, and one in Portugal in August. And yeah, beyond that, I think I'm working on a few bits in the background. I've got a 21-day online course that is self-serve, kind of very much a starting point for people who might be curious about getting into this work. I do in-person events in London. I'm trying to think what else, some online group programs. I'm busy, basically. So yeah, there's lots of different ways. I think the best way to keep in touch with all of that is Instagram. So it's at _breath_space and thebreathspace.co.uk. And yeah, I publish everything through those two. So if people are curious, I'm always happy to chat. Always happy to answer questions. So yeah.
Wow, that's perfect. So your 21-day course, that can, all the information for that's in those two platforms.
Yeah, that's all on my website. Yeah.
Perfect. Jamie, thank you, brother. This has been amazing, and I hope to do it. I'll find an excuse to do it again at some point, I'm sure.
Absolutely,
but
mate.
Thank you so much, mate.
Amazing. Thanks so much for having me, man.